Well, first of all, since in our minds, the common sense view is that nonsense is something kind of unformed, right? And formless and normless. But in reality, that's not correct. I've identified over 70 different types of nonsense. And let me give you some examples. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. Well, that's one example. You can tell that's nonsense. But now listen to this sentence. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but it's a different pattern, right? Or listen to this sentence. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. That is nonsense too, but a total type. And so that if I give you a new sentence and I ask you to classify it by which one of those types it is, you can do it. For example, if I say, when you do this experiment, if you smell an odorless gas, it is carbon monoxide. That would belong to the third type, right? Or we can get into or any, they're just infinite types. And the common sense view of nonsense is totally mistaken. Because if you think about it, the common sense view of nonsense is, if you think of this as the level of ordinary meaningful language, the common sense view is that nonsense is something down here, right? Like something sublinguistic. But anyway, anybody who thinks through it just a little bit will see that no, actually nonsense is something supervenient. It is a more complex form of language than ordinary meaningful language, which is why in many cases, it is closer to the spiritual life. In many spiritual traditions, nonsense is used, for example, to induce ecstatic experiences, and the Christian, and actually glossolalia is a Christian phenomenon, but also it's many other traditions, which is the utterance of nonsense syllables devoid of grammatical form in a sequence. And what this will do is that it will provoke, if you keep at it for a while, it will put you into an astonishing ecstatic state. Or in the Zen Buddhism, the koans were nonsense questions, right? What is the sound of one hand clapping? But the student was put to work on this, and at first they try to solve it by their logical mind, but they eventually it puts you into a state, sort of it pops you over into a state beyond logic, right? And there are many other examples. So this is just something that the Western society muffed on by a very clear sequence of events, namely that Plato, for example, was one way of sort of seeing, as I often use for my students, to some of the things this guy did was Plato, for example, was the first person to distinguish between the noun and the verb. All right. He was the first person to draw the true-false distinction. Somebody else 100 years before had formulated the notion of truth, but Plato added the notion of falsehood. Plato was the first person to distinguish between the literal and the figurative domains of language. See, all of these things had to be thought out. And Plato, in one of his dialogues, was on the way to sort of specifying the rules by which nonsense operates. And he did a good job of it. Actually, he pointed out that one thing can be more nonsensical than another thing. And he pointed out that nonsense, even though it doesn't make any sense, it creates sort of, ideas in your mind. It's like in the Alice books, Alice is asked for her opinion about the poem Jabberwocky. And she says, well, it's very pretty, she said, and it seems to fill my head with ideas, only I don't know exactly what they are. And that's exactly the experience you have with nonsense.